James Williams sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor, staring out at the city below. The glass windows reflected his tired face back at him. At 42, he had everything most people dreamed of. His company was worth over $1 billion. He owned 3 houses, drove expensive cars, and wore suits that cost more than most people made in a month. But none of that mattered anymore. 3 years ago, his life had been perfect. He had a loving wife, Lisa, and a daughter who was the light of his world. 8-year-old Sophie had been everything a parent could ask for. She danced ballet twice a week, played soccer on weekends, and filled their house with laughter and music. Her room was covered with ribbons from dance competitions and photos of her soccer team celebrating their victories. Then came that terrible night in December. They were driving home from Sophie's ballet recital. She had performed beautifully that evening, twirling across the stage in her white tutu while the audience clapped. Lisa was telling Sophie how proud they were when the drunk driver ran the red light. James could still remember every detail. The screech of brakes, the sound of breaking glass, Sophie's small voice crying for her daddy, the ambulance sirens, the smell of the hospital corridors where they spent the next 3 months. The doctors had been gentle but clear. Sophie would never walk again. The accident had damaged her spinal cord. She was paralyzed from the waist down. At first, James thought they could handle it together as a family. He hired the best doctors, bought the most advanced wheelchair, and renovated their house to make everything accessible. He told himself that Sophie was still the same bright, happy girl she had always been, but Lisa couldn't cope. She tried for 6 months, but James could see her pulling away. She stopped looking at Sophie directly. She made excuses to avoid physical therapy appointments. She started working late and taking business trips that seemed to last longer each time. One morning, James woke up to find a note on the kitchen counter. Lisa had packed her bags and left. She wrote that she loved them both, but she couldn't live with the constant reminder of what Sophie had lost. She needed to start over somewhere else. That was 2 years ago. James hadn't heard from her since. Now, at 11 years old, Sophie spent most of her days with Mrs. Thompson, her caregiver. Mrs. Thompson was kind and patient, but she was paid help, not family, not a friend. James threw himself into work. He told himself he was building a secure future for Sophie. He worked 18-hour days, made bigger deals, and earned more money. But the truth was harder to admit. He didn't know how to talk to his daughter anymore. Before the accident, they had talked about everything. Sophie would tell him about her friends at school, her favorite teachers, and her dreams of becoming a professional dancer. Now their conversations felt awkward and forced. They talked about doctor appointments and medicine schedules. They discussed her physical therapy progress and whether she needed new equipment for her wheelchair. The easiest thing was to stay busy, to focus on spreadsheets and business meetings instead of the look in Sophie's eyes when she stared out her bedroom window. Sophie's bedroom window faced the backyard where other neighborhood kids often played. James had caught her sitting there many times, watching children ride their bikes and play games she couldn't join anymore. She never complained, but he could see the loneliness in her small face. The worst part was watching her old friendships fade away. After the accident, Sophie's classmates had visited a few times. They brought flowers and get-well cards, but children that age don't know how to handle something so serious. They became uncomfortable around the wheelchair. They didn't know what to say or do. Birthday party invitations stopped coming. Phone calls became less frequent and then stopped completely. Sophie's former teammates from her soccer club sent a signed card once, but none of them visited. James had tried to help. He offered to drive Sophie to playdates, but the other parents always seemed to have excuses. They were polite but distant. He could see the pity in their eyes when they looked at Sophie, and he hated it. Sophie's school tried to be supportive, but even there, things were different. Her teachers spoke to her more slowly now, as if the accident had affected her mind instead of just her legs. During recess, she sat alone while other children played games she couldn't participate in. At home, Sophie had stopped asking when her friends would visit. She had stopped talking about school much at all. She did her homework quietly, ate her meals without complaint, and spent hours in her room reading books or doing puzzles. Mrs. Thompson worried about her. She had mentioned to James several times that Sophie needed friends her own age. She needed to feel normal again. But James didn't know how to make that happen. He had tried signing Sophie up for adaptive sports programs, but she seemed uninterested. He had looked into support groups for children with disabilities, but Sophie had begged him not to make her go. She said she didn't want to be defined by her wheelchair. James understood that feeling. He didn't want Sophie to be seen as the girl in the wheelchair either. But he was starting to realize that protecting her from that label might have protected her from everything else too. Their house felt empty most of the time. It was too big, too quiet. Sophie's laughter, which had once filled every room, was now a rare sound. James found himself staying late at the office just to avoid the silence at home. When he did get home early, he often found Sophie in the same spot by her bedroom window. She would be doing her homework or reading, but her eyes kept drifting to the window to watch the world outside. James wanted to help her, but he felt helpless. How do you fix something like this? How do you give your child back the life she lost? How do you make other people see past the wheelchair to the amazing girl sitting in it? Sometimes late at night, James would stand outside Sophie's bedroom door and listen to her talking to herself. She would have long conversations with her stuffed animals, telling them stories about imaginary friends who wanted to play with her. It broke his heart every time. He had all the money in the world, but he couldn't buy his daughter what she needed most. He couldn't buy her friendship. He couldn't buy her acceptance. He couldn't buy back her confidence or her joy. James had built a successful company by solving problems and making deals. But this problem seemed impossible to solve. This was about people and feelings and social connections that couldn't be negotiated or purchased. As he sat in his office that day, looking out at the busy street below, James made a decision. It was Saturday, and for once he wasn't going to work. He was going to take Sophie somewhere. Maybe to the park. Maybe they could find a way to connect with other families. He didn't know if it would help, but he had to try something. Sophie deserved better than spending her childhood looking out windows at a world she felt she couldn't be part of. James gathered his papers and headed for the elevator. It was time to stop hiding behind work and start being the father Sophie needed. He had no idea that this simple decision would change both their lives forever. James drove slowly through the neighborhood streets, glancing at Sophie in his rearview mirror. She sat quietly in her wheelchair, which was secured in the back of their specially modified van. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking out the window with that same distant expression he had seen so many times before. "Where would you like to go today?" James asked, trying to sound cheerful. "We could visit the mall or maybe get some ice cream?" Sophie shrugged. "I don't know, Dad, wherever you want." James felt his heart sink a little. There was no excitement in her voice, no curiosity about their rare Saturday adventure. He remembered when she used to bounce in her car seat, chattering about all the things she wanted to do and see. Now she seemed to expect nothing and want nothing. "How about the park?" he suggested. "Maple Grove Park has those nice paved paths. We could walk around the pond and maybe feed the ducks." "Okay," Sophie said simply. When they arrived at the park, James felt a mix of hope and worry. The place was busy with families enjoying the warm Saturday afternoon. Children were running around the playground, riding bikes on the paths and playing games on the grass. It was exactly the kind of normal, happy scene he wanted Sophie to be part of. But as he helped Sophie transfer from the van to her wheelchair, James noticed the looks from other families. Some people stared openly before quickly looking away. Others whispered to their children, probably telling them not to stare. A few parents seemed to pull their kids a little closer, as if disability might be contagious. James pushed Sophie's wheelchair along the smooth pathway, pointing out the ducks on the pond and the colorful flowers in the garden beds. Sophie nodded politely at his comments but didn't seem truly interested in anything. They found a spot near the playground where Sophie could watch the other children play. James hoped that maybe seeing kids her own age having fun might spark something in her. Maybe she would want to join in somehow. Instead, Sophie just sat quietly, watching the children run and climb and swing. Her face showed no emotion, but James could see the sadness in her eyes. She was like a person looking through a window at a party she wasn't invited to. A group of children ran past them, chasing a soccer ball. One boy kicked it too hard, and it rolled right up to Sophie's wheelchair. She looked down at the ball, then up at the children who had stopped running to stare at her. "Sorry," one of the kids mumbled, clearly uncomfortable. He quickly grabbed the ball and ran back to his friends without making eye contact with Sophie. James watched his daughter's face. She tried to smile and said, "It's okay," to the boy's back, but her voice was so quiet he probably didn't hear her. The children resumed their game, but they moved it farther away from where Sophie was sitting. "Dad, can we go home now?" Sophie asked after a few minutes. "We just got here, sweetheart." Maybe we could walk around the pond? I'm tired, she said, though they had barely done anything. James was about to agree when he noticed a man walking toward them. The man was probably in his 30s, wearing old jeans and a work shirt with the name Mike stitched on the pocket. His hands looked rough from manual labor and his boots were worn and scuffed. Next to him was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with curly red hair and a bright yellow t-shirt. Most people would have walked past them, but this man seemed to be walking directly toward their bench. James tensed up, wondering if there was going to be some kind of confrontation. Maybe the man thought they were taking up too much space, or maybe he was going to ask them to move. Instead, the man stopped a few feet away and smiled. "Hi there," he said in a friendly voice. "I'm Mike, and this is my daughter Ruby." The little girl waved enthusiastically. "Hi, I like your wheels," she said to Sophie, pointing at the wheelchair. James was so surprised he didn't know what to say. Most adults told their children not to mention wheelchairs or ask questions about them. But this father didn't seem bothered by his daughter's directness. Sophie looked up for the first time all day, a small smile beginning to form on her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Can it go fast?" Ruby asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "Ruby," Mike said gently, "maybe we should introduce ourselves properly first." He looked at James. "I hope you don't mind us coming over. I noticed you two sitting here, and Ruby has been asking about your daughter since we got here." "I'm James," he replied, still feeling a bit confused but grateful for the friendly approach. "And this is Sophie." "Hi, Sophie," Ruby said as if they were old friends. "Do you want to see something cool? I can do a cartwheel." Without waiting for an answer, Ruby performed an impressive cartwheel right there on the grass. She landed with her arms up in the air, grinning proudly. Sophie actually laughed, a real laugh that James hadn't heard in months. "That was really good," she said. "My dad taught me," Ruby explained. "He used to do gymnastics when he was little." "Can you do tricks with your chair?" James held his breath, waiting to see how Sophie would respond to such a direct question about her disability. Most kids her age got embarrassed or upset when people focused on their wheelchair. But Sophie seemed genuinely pleased by Ruby's interest. "I can spin around really fast," she said, demonstrating by turning her wheels in opposite directions to make her chair rotate in a circle. "Whoa," Ruby exclaimed, clapping her hands. "That's so cool. I bet you could beat me in a race." "Ruby loves to race," Mike explained to James. "She challenges everyone, me, the neighbor's dog, kids on bicycles. She's not afraid of friendly competition." "Sophie used to run track at school," James said, then immediately worried he had said the wrong thing. He didn't want to remind Sophie of what she could no longer do, but Sophie didn't seem upset. Instead, she looked thoughtful. "I still have strong arms from physical therapy," she said. "Maybe I could race in my wheelchair." "Yes," Ruby shouted. "Can we race now, please?" Mike looked at James questioningly. "Would that be okay? The path around the pond is pretty smooth." James looked at Sophie, who was sitting up straighter than she had all day. There was something bright in her eyes that had been missing for so long. "What do you think, Sophie? Do you want to try racing?" "I think I'd like that," Sophie said, and her voice was stronger than it had been all afternoon. They moved to the paved path that circled the pond. Mike explained the rules. They would race from the big oak tree to the park bench about 100 yards away. Ruby would run and Sophie would use her wheelchair. "On your mark," Mike called out, acting as the official starter. "Get set, go." Ruby took off running as fast as her little legs could carry her, her curly hair bouncing behind her. Sophie pushed hard on her wheels, and James was amazed at how fast she could move when she was motivated. The race was close, but Sophie crossed the finish line just ahead of Ruby. Both girls were breathing hard and laughing. "You're really fast," Ruby panted. "Can we race again?" "That was fun," Sophie admitted, and James could see she meant it. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, and she looked more alive than she had in years. Mike walked over to James as the girls continued chatting. "I hope that was all right," he said. "Ruby doesn't really understand about being polite or cautious around differences. She just sees another kid to play with." "It was perfect," James said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie hasn't smiled like that since before her accident. For the first time in 3 years, James felt like his daughter might find her way back to being a happy child again. The next Saturday, Sophie surprised James by asking if they could go back to the park. She had spent the entire week thinking about her race with Ruby and wondering if they might see them again. James felt a spark of hope as he helped Sophie into the van. It was the first time in years that she had actually wanted to do something. When they arrived at Maple Grove Park, Sophie's eyes immediately started scanning the area for Ruby's bright yellow shirt and curly red hair. James pushed her wheelchair along the same path they had taken the week before, both of them looking for their new friends. "There they are," Sophie called out, pointing toward the playground. Sure enough, Mike was sitting on a bench while Ruby played on the swings. Ruby spotted them at the same moment and came running over, her face bright with excitement. "Sophie, you came back. I was hoping you would be here." The pure joy in Ruby's voice made James smile. When was the last time anyone had been so excited to see Sophie? "Hi, Ruby," Sophie said, and James noticed that her voice was stronger and more confident than it had been the previous week. Mike walked over to join them, carrying a small backpack. "Hey there. Ruby has been talking about you two all week. She made me promise we'd come back to the park today." "Sophie has been looking forward to it too," James admitted, glancing at his daughter with pride. "Can we race again?" Ruby asked immediately. "I've been practicing. I ran around our apartment building 3 times yesterday." Sophie laughed. "I've been practicing too. Mrs. Thompson helped me work on my wheelchair technique." As the girls prepared for their rematch, Mike sat down on the bench next to James. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what happened to Sophie?" Ruby asked me, and I wasn't sure what to tell her. James felt his usual defensive response rising up, but something about Mike's gentle tone made him pause. "Car accident 3 years ago. Drunk driver ran a red light." "I'm sorry," Mike said simply. "That must have been incredibly hard." "It was," James said, surprised by his own honesty. "Still is, really. I keep trying to fix things, but some things can't be fixed." Mike nodded slowly. "I know something about that. Ruby's mom died of cancer 2 years ago. I kept thinking if I worked harder, earned more money, found better doctors, maybe I could save her. But sometimes life just doesn't work that way." James looked at Mike with new understanding. Here was someone who truly knew what it was like to have your world fall apart. "How do you do it? How do you stay positive for Ruby?" "Honestly, some days I don't. Some days I hide in the bathroom and cry after Ruby goes to bed. But she taught me something important. Kids are tougher than we think they are, and they don't need us to be perfect. They just need us to show up." On the path ahead of them, the girls had finished their race. This time Ruby had won, but both girls were laughing and high-fiving each other. There was no disappointment, no jealousy, just pure fun. "Ruby doesn't see Sophie's wheelchair," Mike observed. "She just sees a friend who can go fast and likes to have fun." "Other kids aren't like that," James said quietly. "They stare, or they avoid her, or their parents make excuses not to have playdates." "Yeah, well, Ruby's always been different. She makes friends with everyone. The elderly man who walks his dog past our apartment, the lady at the grocery store who gives her free cookies, the teenager next door who plays guitar too loud. She doesn't see barriers the way adults do." Over the next few weeks, Saturday afternoons at the park became the highlight of both girls' weeks. James started packing snacks and drinks while Mike brought a small first aid kit and extra hair ties for when Ruby's curls got too wild during their activities. The girls created their own games. They had wheelchair races where Ruby would run alongside Sophie, cheering her on. They played catch with a soft foam ball, with Sophie catching and throwing from her chair while Ruby ran around to retrieve wild tosses. They even invented a version of hide and seek, where Sophie would close her eyes and count, while Ruby found creative hiding spots around the playground. But it was the quiet moments that really showed how deep their friendship was becoming. They would sit together under the big oak tree, with Ruby cross-legged on the grass next to Sophie's wheelchair, sharing stories and secrets the way children do. Ruby told Sophie about her mom, how she used to make the best pancakes in the world, and how she would sing Ruby to sleep every night. Sophie shared memories of dancing ballet and how she missed the feeling of spinning across the stage. "I bet you were beautiful when you danced," Ruby said one afternoon. "Maybe you could still dance. Just differently." "How do you mean?" Sophie asked. Ruby jumped up and started moving her arms gracefully while keeping her feet planted. "Like this, dancing with your arms and your heart. The best kind of dancing comes from inside anyway." Sophie tried copying Ruby's movements, moving her arms and shoulders to an imaginary rhythm. For the first time since the accident, she felt a little bit like a dancer again. Meanwhile, James and Mike were discovering they had more in common than their different backgrounds might suggest. Mike worked as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop, getting his hands dirty fixing engines and changing oil. James worked in gleaming office buildings, making deals and managing spreadsheets. But both men were single fathers trying to do right by their daughters. "I used to work all the time," James confessed one Saturday. "I thought if I earned enough money I could somehow make up for what Sophie lost. But I was just running away from dealing with it." "I did the opposite," Mike said. "After Ruby's mom died, I was so afraid something would happen to Ruby too that I hardly let her out of my sight. I was protecting her from everything, including the chance to be happy." "What changed?" James asked. Mike smiled, watching Ruby teach Sophie how to braid grass into a crown. "Ruby did. She told me one day that her mom wouldn't want us to be sad all the time. She said her mom would want us to find reasons to smile again. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for." As the weeks passed, the friendship extended beyond Saturday afternoons. Sophie asked James if Ruby could call her during the week. Soon, the two girls were talking on the phone every Tuesday and Thursday evening, sharing stories about school and planning their weekend adventures. Ruby would draw pictures and mail them to Sophie, crayon drawings of the two of them playing at the park, racing, laughing, and having tea parties under the oak tree. Sophie would ask James to help her pick out small gifts for Ruby, art supplies, children's books, and puzzles they could work on together. Mrs. Thompson noticed the change in Sophie immediately. The quiet, withdrawn girl had been replaced by someone who sang while doing her physical therapy exercises and looked forward to each new day. Sophie started paying attention to her schoolwork again and even asked about joining the school's art club. "She's becoming herself again," Mrs. Thompson told James one evening. "Not the same person she was before, that girl is gone. But this new version of Sophie is pretty wonderful too." James realized that Mrs. Thompson was right. Sophie was changing, growing, becoming someone new, and for the first time since the accident, James felt proud of the strong, resilient person his daughter was becoming. The friendship with Ruby hadn't fixed everything, but it had given Sophie something precious. The knowledge that she was worth caring about, exactly as she was. 3 months into their friendship, Sophie did something that shocked everyone, including herself. She asked James if she could invite Ruby over to their house for a sleepover. James almost dropped his coffee cup. Sophie hadn't had a friend over since before the accident. Their big house had been silent for so long that the idea of children's laughter filling it again seemed almost impossible. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" James asked carefully. He didn't want to discourage her, but he also didn't want her to be disappointed if things didn't go well. "I'm sure, Dad. Ruby has been telling me about her favorite movies, and I want to show her my room. Besides, Mrs. Thompson makes the best chocolate chip cookies and Ruby loves cookies." James called Mike that evening, and they arranged for Ruby to spend Saturday night at the Williams house. James was nervous about having a guest, especially one from such a different background. He worried that Ruby might feel uncomfortable in their expensive home, or that Mike might think James was showing off. But when Saturday came, Ruby bounced through their front door like she belonged there. She admired the high ceilings and the big staircase, but what really excited her were Sophie's art supplies and the collection of books in her room. "Wow, you have so many books," Ruby exclaimed, running her fingers along the spines on Sophie's bookshelf. "I love reading, but our library at home is just one small shelf." "You can borrow any books you want," Sophie said immediately. "I've read most of these already, and books are better when they're shared." The girls spent the afternoon doing art projects, with Ruby helping Sophie paint a picture of the park where they first met. Mrs. Thompson made her famous cookies, and Ruby declared them even better than the ones at the grocery store bakery. That evening, as James tucked the girls in for their sleepover, he overheard part of their conversation. "Your dad seems really nice," Ruby whispered in the dark. "He is," Sophie replied. "He used to work all the time, but now he spends more time with me. I think meeting you and your dad helped him remember how to be happy." "My dad is happier too," Ruby said. "He smiles more now. He says having friends makes everything better." James stood outside the door for a moment, feeling something shift in his chest. The house felt alive again, filled with the kind of warmth and joy it had been missing for years. The next morning, when Mike came to pick up Ruby, he seemed amazed by the change in his daughter. She was chattier than usual, excited to tell him about all the books Sophie had let her borrow and the cookies they had made together. "Thank you," Mike said to James as they watched the girls say goodbye. "Ruby hasn't been this excited about anything since before her mom died. This friendship means everything to her. It means everything to Sophie, too," James replied. "And to me, honestly. I was starting to think she might never be happy again." As the weeks passed, the friendship continued to grow in unexpected ways. Sophie started asking James about activities she could do with Ruby. She wanted to find places they could go together, things they could try that would work for both of them. James found himself researching accessible activities for the first time since Sophie's accident. Before, he had focused on medical treatments and equipment. Now he was looking for fun, places where Sophie could feel normal and included. He discovered an adaptive sports center across town that offered wheelchair basketball and racing. When he mentioned it to Sophie, her eyes lit up with interest. "Could Ruby come watch me play?" Sophie asked. "I'm sure she'd love to," James said, already imagining Ruby cheering from the sidelines. Mike was dealing with his own changes. Ruby's confidence had grown so much through her friendship with Sophie that she was making friends at school, too. She had started standing up for other kids who were being left out, just like Sophie had been. One day, Ruby came home from school and told Mike about a new girl in her class who didn't speak much English yet. "She sits by herself at lunch because she's scared to talk to anyone. I think she needs a friend." The next day, Ruby sat with the new girl at lunch using gestures and simple words to communicate. Soon other children joined them and the new girl found her place in the class. "Ruby is becoming a leader," her teacher told Mike during parent conferences. "She has this natural ability to include everyone and make them feel welcome. It's a rare gift in someone so young." Mike shared this story with James during one of their Saturday afternoons at the park. "I think Ruby learned that from Sophie," he said. "She saw how lonely Sophie was and how good it felt to be the person who reached out. Now she does it for everyone." James had been thinking a lot about reaching out too. He had started noticing things around town that made life difficult for people with disabilities. Stores with steps instead of ramps, playgrounds where wheelchairs couldn't go, community centers that weren't accessible. "I want to do something," James told Mike one afternoon. "I have resources and I've been wasting them on things that don't matter. I want to help make this town better for kids like Sophie." Mike looked at him thoughtfully. "What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking about the community center where you said Ruby's soccer team practices. Sophie mentioned she might want to try wheelchair basketball, but the building isn't accessible." "It's not," Mike confirmed. "There are 3 steps up to the main entrance and the bathroom doors are too narrow for wheelchairs. A lot of families in our neighborhood would love to use that place, but they can't." James made some calls the following week. Within a month, construction had started on accessibility improvements at the community center. Ramps were installed, bathrooms were widened, and the playground equipment was updated to include features that children with disabilities could use. The project brought James into contact with families he had never met before. Working-class families who lived in Mike's neighborhood, immigrant families who were new to the area, and families dealing with disabilities who had been quietly struggling without support. One afternoon, James was at the community center checking on the construction progress when an elderly woman approached him. She was walking with a cane and looked tired. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the man who's paying for all these changes?" James nodded, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his expensive suit in this modest neighborhood. "I want to thank you," the woman continued. "I'm Betty and I run the after-school program here. We've had to turn away so many children over the years because their families couldn't get into the building. You're going to change that." "I'm just glad I can help," James said. "It's more than help," Betty replied. "It's hope. You're showing these kids that they matter, that they belong in their own community." When James told Sophie about his conversation with Betty, she surprised him with her response. "Dad, could I maybe help with the after-school program? I mean, when I'm older. I think I'd like to work with kids who feel different or left out." James felt his eyes fill with tears. Before the accident, Sophie had wanted to be a professional dancer. After the accident, she had stopped talking about the future at all. Now, for the first time, she was imagining a life where her experiences could help other people. "I think you'd be wonderful at that," James told her. "You understand things that other people don't." That night, James called his business partner and told him he wanted to restructure his schedule. He wanted to spend more time with Sophie and more time working on projects that actually mattered. The changes at the community center were almost finished, and James was planning a grand reopening celebration. He wanted it to be a day when the whole neighborhood could come together and celebrate what was possible when people looked out for each other. 2 years had passed since that first meeting at the park, and the grand reopening of the renovated community center had arrived. James stood at the entrance watching families stream through the new accessible doors, and he could hardly believe how much had changed. Sophie, now 13, was racing around the parking lot with Ruby, who had just turned 9. But Sophie wasn't alone this time. 3 other children in wheelchairs were racing alongside her, all of them laughing and shouting encouragement to each other. It was like a scene from a completely different world than the one James had known just 2 years ago. "Dad, look how fast Tommy can go," Sophie called out, pointing to a boy about her age who was spinning his wheels like a pro. "He just started coming to wheelchair basketball and he's already beating me in races." James smiled, remembering when Sophie had been afraid to try anything new. Now she was the one encouraging other children to join activities and try new things. She had become exactly what Ruby had been for her, the person who said, "You belong here," to kids who felt left out. Mike walked over carrying a box of decorations for the celebration. His work shirt was clean and pressed, and he was wearing new boots, the first new pair he had bought in years. Business had picked up at the auto shop after James had started recommending Mike's services to his business contacts. More than that, though, Mike looked relaxed and happy in a way he hadn't for years after his wife died. "Ruby's been talking about this day for weeks," Mike told James. "She wants to show everyone the art room where she and Sophie have been teaching painting classes." The art classes had been Sophie's idea. 6 months ago, she had noticed that some of the younger children at the community center seemed bored during the after-school program. She had asked Betty, the program director, if she and Ruby could teach an art class once a week. "I remember how good it felt when Ruby wanted to be my friend," Sophie had explained to James when she first suggested the idea. "Maybe we can help other kids feel that way too." The art classes had been such a success that they now had a waiting list. Sophie and Ruby had developed their own teaching style. Ruby would demonstrate techniques while Sophie helped kids who were struggling or feeling frustrated. They made a perfect team, just like they had from the very beginning. As the afternoon celebration continued, James found himself talking to families he never would have met before the community center project. There was Carlos, whose son had autism, and had been afraid to join group activities until Sophie and Ruby included him in their art class. There was Mrs. Park, whose granddaughter had been too shy to make friends until Ruby invited her to join their weekend adventures at the park. "Your daughter changed my grandson's life," Carlos told James. "He used to think no one wanted to play with him because he was different. Now he knows that different kids can be the best friends of all." James looked over at Sophie, who was helping a little girl named Lily transfer from her wheelchair to a swing on the new accessible playground equipment. Sophie's patience was incredible. She never rushed anyone or made them feel bad for needing help. She seemed to understand exactly how scary it could be to try new things when you felt different from everyone else. "The funny thing is," James replied to Carlos, "Sophie learned all of that from a 7-year-old girl who just walked up to us at the park one day and asked if Sophie's wheelchair could do tricks." Ruby had grown too, though she was still the same fearless, friendly child who had changed everything that day at the park. She was now known throughout their elementary school as the kid who made sure no one sat alone at lunch. Teachers often asked Ruby to help new students feel welcome, and she took the job seriously. "Ruby has a gift," her teacher had told Mike during their most recent conference. "She sees past differences to find what connects people. Some adults never learn that skill." As the celebration continued, Betty took the microphone to make a short speech. 2 years ago, this building had barriers that kept many of our neighbors from joining us. Today, thanks to the generosity of the Williams family, everyone can participate in our programs. The crowd applauded, but Betty held up her hand. "But I want to tell you the real story behind these changes. It's not just about money or construction. It's about 2 little girls who became friends despite having very different lives. Their friendship taught their fathers, and all of us, that when we reach out to someone who seems different, we don't just help them. We help ourselves too." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He thought about the man he had been 2 years ago. working 18-hour days, hiding from his own daughter's needs, convinced that money was the only solution to their problems. That man felt like a stranger now. These days, James left work at 5 o'clock every day. He had dinner with Sophie, helped her with homework, and listened to her stories about her day. His company was actually doing better than ever, because he had learned to trust his team and focus on what really mattered. Sophie had started talking about what she wanted to do when she grew up. She was interested in becoming a teacher or maybe a counselor who worked with children who had disabilities or difficult experiences. "I want to help kids who feel like I used to feel," she had told him. "I want them to know that being different doesn't mean being less than everyone else." James knew she would be incredible at whatever she chose to do. Sophie had developed a wisdom and compassion that came from surviving something difficult and finding her way back to joy. As the sun began to set, the celebration moved indoors for dinner. James sat at a long table surrounded by families from every part of town, wealthy families from his neighborhood, working families from Mike's area, immigrant families, families dealing with disabilities, elderly residents, and young couples just starting out. Ruby was in the middle of telling a story about a race she and Sophie had organized at school, complete with dramatic sound effects and exaggerated gestures. Everyone at the table was laughing, including Sophie, who added her own commentary about Ruby's storytelling skills. "Remember when we first met, you guys?" Ruby said suddenly, looking at James and Sophie. Sophie looked so sad sitting by the playground. "I told my dad I wanted to be her friend, and he said that was a good idea." "Best idea you ever had," Mike said, ruffling Ruby's hair. "I was scared that day," Sophie admitted. "I thought no one would ever want to be my friend again. But Ruby didn't care about my wheelchair. She just wanted to play." "I still think your wheelchair is cool," Ruby said matter-of-factly. "But now I know the coolest thing about you isn't your wheels. It's how kind you are to everyone." James looked around the table at all these people who had become part of their extended family. He thought about that Saturday 2 years ago when he had decided to take Sophie to the park instead of going to the office. It had been such a small decision, but it had changed everything. Sometimes the most important moments in life don't announce themselves. They look like ordinary Saturday afternoons, chance meetings, and 7-year-old girls who aren't afraid to walk up to strangers and offer friendship. That night, as James tucked Sophie into bed, she smiled at him with contentment. "Dad, I'm really happy," she said simply. "Me too, sweetheart," James replied. "Me too." Outside her window, the neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of children playing in the distance. It was the sound of a community where everyone belonged, where differences were celebrated, and where one small act of friendship had created ripples that would continue spreading for years to come.